Okay, basically what I want to talk in the next 15 minutes is we talk a lot about rebuilding a country after a disaster, and we talk a lot about quality of the reconstruction. But one thing we need to consider is the fight against corruption. Because we know that when we have a disaster, we have more and more cases of fraud and corruption, and this will basically prevent the right process of reconstructions. And we have many examples where basically, if we take, for example, Haiti, where it was not the first disaster they had lately, but in the past they had disaster, and when they start rebuilding the country, a lot of funds were diverted, and basically when you have another disaster, it's a catastrophe because the way they did rebuild the country was not appropriate because most of the funds were diverted. So basically the message here is really to talk about the corruption, how we can fight corruption, and how corruption, if we reduce the risk of corruption, how this will make a better process. So the risk of corruption is really in all the different components of a disaster. I mean, the first is, I would say, what will contribute to a disaster, because we know that with the global warming, we have this will impact the environment, and this can create disaster. We know that in many cases on the environment, for example, when you have the organized crime, this will also impact the environment, and this could create also a disaster. We can take a couple of examples in Italy, for example, where in the waste industry, where the mafia is doing a lot of well, basically they just put the waste in different fields, and this will impact the environment. Now, when you have the disaster, if you want to reduce the impact, basically you will need the commitment from the cities and for the government. But the problem is how much funds they will allocate to take this issue and to tackle basically this issue. And we know that and I'm not just talking about developing country, but in all countries we have corruption cases where basically the government didn't allocate enough resources to have resilient cities. And after you have also the issue when you have a disaster and you want to rebuild the country, and all those money coming to the country to rebuild, we know that a big piece is going to individual and not really to rebuild the countries. And we have many examples for example, that you will build a building, but it's a temporary building. You will pay the high price of the building, but actually you have low quality material. So basically, the temporary building will become a permanent building, and when you have a new disaster, of course, you will have an impact on the human being and also on the construction. An important piece is really important to engage the private sector. It's not only an issue of the public sector. And basically, what I'm trying to say here is why the private sector should be engaged in the fight against corruption. First, the private sector, they are basically the private sectors will operate in countries, and they will be impacted by the disaster. But we know that when you have corruption, you have the one who receive the bribes, but you also have someone that will pay the bribe. So basically, the private sector will really need to commit and to stop to pay bribes. Yeah. And also, we know that the private sector contributes to the climate change. So it's reason why more and more you will see the private sector involved in this fight. And how the private sector can help, I mean, the first one, as I was saying, is we need to change the behavior. So basically, in terms of governance, good governance, and to stop, paying bribes. Also, the private sector, can really contribute because they have great knowledge, and they will have to share the know-how to government or to cities. By sharing this, the private sector can really contribute to the quality of the reconstruction of cities. And obviously, the private sector, they have money, they can help, with pro bono work, and basically sharing, the know-how on a pro bono basis. A couple of figures on corruption. Corruption is a real market. I mean, we are talking about a year about 1 trillion, meaning that it's not isolated. It's really concerning all the different countries. We know also that the corruption will have a direct impact in developing countries because this will affect the growth and the development of the countries. So it's really an issue that we need to tackle, because if we manage to fight corruption, meaning that we can really contribute to developing the country, and the money might be going to prevent the consequence of disaster. And also an important piece is when we take the example of Pakistan, for example, after the flooding, I can guarantee that the amount of donation and fundings were very low, because people were reluctant to give money to Pakistan because they did not really trust the government, and they say, well, if I give the money, how do I ensure the money is going to the reconstruction of the country? A couple of figures also, in Africa, according to Transparency International, we have about 30 billion aids that are going to that are needed to foreign bank accounts, meaning that all the aids going to Africa, we have about 30 billion going to individual. The World Bank, also show a couple of examples of one Asia country that they said that they have lost 48 billion in the past 20 years, and the 48 billion, with this money, they would have been able, to pay off the debt. One common pattern is basically when you have more corruptions after disaster, and one of the reasons of this is because you have a high involvement of the states. You have a lack of coordination, and also because everything is around emergency. So all the processes you can have in place, for example, bidding process to select the vendors, all those are bypassed. And we have a lot of fraud around, fictitious NGOs, a lot of fraud about NGOs owned by government, distribution of relief goods to unaffected people. So we have a lot of examples where basically it's not only about corruption, but about fraud. When you have the corruption cases in the reconstruction process, we have a lot of examples where basically hospitals, school, and building were not sustainable. And we have also examples where it's not sustainable for the next disaster, but sometimes it doesn't even last a year. One example in India in 2001 and 2002, they received enough donation to feed 20 million workers for a year, and most of the food were diverted and sold, on parallel market. So other example, for example, in Pakistan, as I was saying, they did not receive that much, funding because of the risk of corruption and the lack of transparent mechanism. And what is worried is that in 2005 there was an earthquake, and basically the government acknowledged that the main issue there was the lack of transparency of funds used to rebuild the damaged area. And we know that now the same is happening again. So we don't really learn from the past. Haiti, same. We have well, the fight against corruption is not that easy. We have in 2004, between 2004 and 2008, they're trying to create anti-corruption unit and also a world commission. But the person in charge, was kidnapped and just disappeared. And we have also the person in charge of, to investigate how the funds were used was just dismissed. So the fight is not that easy. We also have example in the post-war reconstructions. For example, in Afghanistan, they were building a highway in 2004. The road was built, very quickly, but was disintegrated, very quickly as well. And other example, for example, for school, they were building, 533 school and clinic, and we know that the cost, they were paying high cost, more than 200,000, but the estimated cost was 50,000. So you just do the difference, 150,000 were diverted, and all the buildings didn't last, the winter. So just as a closing thought, I think it's really important that when we have a disaster, to be a little bit more transparent. And I think we need to have all the different parties involved. In India, we have success where basically we are the victim involved in the reconstruction process. But I think we need to balance between the public, private sector, and also the victim. And it's really important to have anti-corruption, to really tackle the corruption, because we cannot be successful in the reconstruction process if we don't tackle this issue. Okay, thank you.